Welcome to the weekly show with Trevor McManus. Joining me today is a man who literally is the be-all and end-all for hockey in Canada. He's a former editor of the Hockey News, columnist for the Toronto Star, and now you can see him pretty much on any show on TSN, as well as all over sports radio across Canada. If that wasn't enough, you can find him all over Twitter, where he has over 500,000 loyal followers. Bob McKenzie. Bob, thanks for joining me today.
Hey, my pleasure, Trevor.
I want to start off by asking you your backstory. How did you become such an influential member of hockey in Canada? I know you wrote for the Toronto Star, you're editor-in-chief for the Hockey News for nearly a decade, but how did you propel yourself into the heights that we see you today?
That's a good question. I guess just one day at a time. It sounds like a cliche, but that's kind of the way you have to approach any career. And I started off, I went to Ryerson, the journalism program in Toronto. I got a job there at the summer between second and third year, working at the Sault Star in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. I graduated from there and got a full-time job covering the Sault Greyhounds for a couple of years, and came back to Toronto, worked freelance for a year, and luckily enough got the job as editor-in-chief of the Hockey News when I was 25 years old, and that was back in 1982. So I was always primarily a print guy, a newspaper guy. That was all I'd ever planned on being. I never ever envisioned being in broadcasting or television or any of that. And one thing just led to another. And the late 70s, I started doing a little bit of freelance work for TSN and some other networks. And that just kind of snowballed. And by the year 2000, I'd given up my newspaper job for full-time broadcasting.
Do you have any advice for young broadcasters?
I don't know. I guess it's cliched, hackneyed stuff like, work hard and, you got to have a point of difference. I mean, there's so many people that want to do it. So what makes anybody who's breaking into the business any different or special than anybody else? So my big thing was I knew from a fairly early age that I really wanted to specialize, that hockey was what interested me, and that I was going to devote all my energies to covering hockey and nothing else. I was fortunate enough to be able to have some success doing that. That doesn't work for everybody. Some people need to be generalists and cover a lot of things. But for me, I found being a specialist was the route to go. So all I could suggest to anybody who's looking to break into the business is you better be prepared to work hard and just try to find something that separates you from the masses.
How do you stay unbiased?
I don't know. I know I like to be unbiased, but I hate having a vested interest. Used to be difficult with international hockey, I found. I'm a Canadian, so when you go to an international hockey event, you historically, I would say certainly in the 80s when I covered the game and a little bit in the 90s, you would want Canada to win. And yet I felt uncomfortable with that, because if they lost, you'd kind of feel bummed out about it a little bit. And I can remember the last time that really happened for me was the World Cup, I believe I want to say it was 1996, and Canada lost to the Americans. And I kind of, when it was over, I was covering it, but I kind of felt bad, and I thought that's not a good way to do your job. So I've weaned myself off of even international hockey. I got to be honest, when Sidney Crosby scored the golden goal in Vancouver, I was sitting in the stands just right behind the net where it happened, actually about 20, 30 feet from where it happened, and everybody jumped up, and I just sat in my seat and barely acknowledged it. And that's kind of the way I choose to cover the game. Some people find that hard to believe, but certainly, I grew up as a kid, a Leaf fan in the 1960s in Toronto, but long ago stopped being a fan of any one team. So I find it actually easier to be objective and much more difficult to have any kind of allegiance, because once you have a rooting interest, it really does cloud the way you look at the game.
You can follow Bob McKenzie on Twitter at TSN Bob McKenzie. I've seen some people who verbally abuse you just for the sake of doing it. Bob, how do you deal with internet trolls?
Well, most of the time you just ignore them. Sometimes you block them, but occasionally I'll engage, and I do that a lot less now than I used to. But every so often you like to send a message, fire a shot over somebody's head a little bit, and have a little fun just to show you're human or whatever. But for the most part, I generally ignore it. And most of the people aren't worth the trouble. And unless you're a person who's in the mood for a bit of a scrap, which I am some days, I guess, I basically ignore it.
Do you enjoy the way the sporting world has gone, and even the world in general with social media, or do you prefer it how it used to be with just print, radio, and TV?
I think it's good. I think there's far more positives than negatives. I mean, Twitter's the greatest thing in the world. It's a personal news feed. You can tailor it to whatever you want. When I look at all the great people who cover the National Hockey League, beat reporters for newspapers, columnists, bloggers, whatever, there's a lot of really interesting and timely information. I mean, the guys that cover the NHL teams are going out and they're live tweeting practice. You know what the line combinations are. You know if somebody came off with an injury. To have access to that information, have it come to your phone wherever you are, whenever. That's unbelievable. In the old days, it would take minutes, hours, days, weeks to gather all that information, and you had to do it. It was labor intensive, and now it's without doing anything, it comes directly to your phone or your computer. So I think the positives far outweigh the negatives. I do think that we're all probably a little guilty of looking at things in 140 character perspectives. And that, I mean, recent example for me, all anybody tweeted for 2 weeks was Ryan Clough had no goals. He had no goals, and made jokes and mocking. How could the New York Rangers, how could so many teams be interested in a guy who has no goals, without ever once saying, well, the last 4 seasons before this one, he's averaged 20 goals and 55 points, and he's a prototypical power forward who can hit and fight. I mean, we get lost sometimes in the immediacy of Twitter and don't do some of the basic homework that's required.
Speaking with TSN analyst, hockey insider Bob McKenzie. If there's a panel on TSN, you can find Bob there for sure. Also on Twitter at TSN Bob McKenzie. Bob, we're in BC, so the hot button issue has been Roberto Luongo, and well, it's been an issue for nearly a year now. How is this still an issue, and how do you foresee the end result?
Well, I'd have to assume that it's going to end this summer. It's unfortunate for Roberto Luongo and perhaps for the Canucks that they didn't get the deal done at the deadline. But I also understand why it happened. The Canucks for the longest time had hoped to get a tangible asset back that would help them down the stretch and into the playoffs. Became apparent on deadline day without any doubt they were not going to get that tangible asset that would help them now. And that if the deal was going to get done, it was going to be future considerations in the form with the Leafs of Ben Scrivens, a backup netminder, and which they would need if Roberto's gone, and some draft picks. But I guess the deal fell apart perhaps on the issue of some of the Canucks taking back some money. And I understand why they don't want to do that. They think that this summer there's going to be some teams that will want Roberto Luongo, and they won't have to take any money back, and that they might get the same future considerations in draft picks and a backup goalie or more if they wait. And ultimately, we won't know until the summer whether that's right or wrong. But it was an easy decision to say no, because what they were giving up at that time wasn't going to help them down the stretch and into the playoffs. So they'll roll the dice this summer that it's not going to cost them more money or cost them the future considerations that they had on the table.
You're speaking about the trade deadline. It's come and gone. Can you tell me what it's like to sit in front of a camera trying to get a bunch of information and nothing is coming to you like this past week? Was it feeling like the prototypical hot seat, as it were?
No, not too much. I'm fortunate in that on trade deadline day, it's guys like James Duthie and Aaron Ward and Mike Johnson and Ray Ferraro have to really carry the ball and talk about things that haven't happened yet. Whereas myself, Pierre LeBrun, Darren Dreger, Gord Miller, it's our job to go out and dig up the information. So information, the trades might happen, they might not, but it's all labor intensive in terms of finding out what's going on. So whether the deals come or not, we do the same amount of work and it's the same job that you're trying to do. So it's really not all that different than what I do a lot of other days, except that they come to us every half hour for a comment on what's going on. So
is deadline day something you look forward to, or is it a rough go because it's such a long day?
Well, it's, there's a little more, I don't want to say pressure, but a little more spotlight on that particular day. All the networks are out there competing for eyeballs and to be first and to be right and those things. So, but you know what, as I say, and I've said this before, and I guess it's a cliche, but the day is not all that different than a normal day for me. I do this all the time. A lot of people just kind of pick up on it at the deadline because there's more attention and there's more fish in the barrel, if you want to use that analogy. And you're much more likely to get some results if you pick up the phone and call people right around deadline day because there's more deals happening. But it's kind of, every day I go to work, I try to identify who might get traded, who might get signed, who might get fired, where are the stories, who's injured, what's going on. And that just requires picking up the phone or sending a lot of texts or emails and see what the latest and greatest information is. And if you get it, then get it to air or Twitter or whatever as quickly as possible. So technically the day is not that much different. It's just a lot more people focusing on it, I suppose, and evaluating your work that day.
Joining us right now is a man who literally knows everything inside hockey and out. He is Bob McKenzie. And Bob, thank you for joining us today. If you want to hold for just a moment, we'll get to some viewers' questions right after the break.